Thank you so much, Natasha, for the introduction. And it's my pleasure. So excited to meet you all here today to talk about children on plantations. Etania schools began in 2009, and you can see in our next slide that we are dealing with undocumented, stateless, and marginalized children in Sabah. These children have a right to an education. We try to adhere to the SDG 4 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is about providing a quality education for all children. We are also very passionate about adhering to the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And so we've been running these schools since 2009, and we have 11 schools, and as Natasha mentioned, with about 1,000 children. In our next slide, you can see a sample of one of our schools. Thank you, Natasha. We have four schools on private plantations of the 11, and we have another one on a government plantation. These plantations are remote. They are usually without internet access, but all of them have a clinic for the children for health. They have reasonable roads. They are well serviced by with having a small shop for the workers, and access to within the plantation to the various schools on the plantation, because some plantations have 2 or 3 schools, is quite satisfactory. However, the children cannot go out of the plantation for fear of being captured by authorities. The reason for this is because they are undocumented. So it's dangerous for them to be wandering around on any of the main roads, because that's where they're patrolled by the immigration or police. So the tragic situation in Sabah is there are tens of thousands of children who are in the situation of having no access to quality education. And this is one of the reasons why Etania began its schools. In the next slide, I'd like to point out the issue about citizenship. So in recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of plantations are making a big effort to get the parents, the families documented. And I noticed this very clearly. In the previous years, women couldn't get a passport. Now they can. So once the parents are documented, then the children can apply for a passport. But despite this amazing development in the last few years, there still are thousands and thousands of children who don't have documentation. And I think this has become a very thorny issue in Malaysia, because they're not recognized as human beings. Whether they live or die, it doesn't matter to anyone. They're like the invisible children of Sabah. So I'm quite proud and happy with the plantations that I work on, because they're really making a big effort to get citizenship for the workers. Not only education, but in the next slide, I'd like to talk very briefly about health and poverty. A lot of our families come from very low socioeconomic groups, and some are caught up in webs of deceit by various mandors that bring them to the plantation. These mandors, I should point out, excuse me, are from their own race of people. They're not from Malaysia. The mandors bring workers into the plantation. And I don't have time to explain about this now, but I'm sure many of you are aware that there is exploitation going on for the workers through this mandor system. By and large, all plantations have a clinic, as I mentioned. Under MSPO, RSPO, they must obey and have this infrastructure for all their workers. So recently too, I've noticed the Malaysian health is giving vaccinations to our children, which is a very commendable effort on their part. For me, because I'm an educator and that's my passion, the next slide, you can see that plantations now almost all have set up schools, or we call them learning centers, Alternative Learning Center or ALC. So some plantations will have several, and some will just have one learning center for the children. It's logical to have a learning center on a plantation, because without this, firstly, the children run wild and get in the way of everybody else. Secondly, I guess they could be open to exploitation, and they're very vulnerable in this situation. But most important for me is I noticed there's an awareness among the plantation owners, and I really commend them for this, that the children need to be educated. They need to be taught good values. They need to have an academic curriculum. They need to have a non-academic curriculum, so that in the future, when they themselves either become workers on this plantation or they move elsewhere, they have qualifications that can set them up for a better standing in life. As far as I know, and I've been working on my plantations for the past 11, nearly 12 years, I have not seen child labor on the plantations I work on. I cannot speak for other plantations. Yes, the children do help their parents after school. According to United Nations, a child is permitted to work under 14 hours a week. Sometimes the children pick up the palm oil kernels that have dropped to the ground, or they do a little bit of weeding and whatnot to help the parents, but they are not employed by the estate. They are just helping out their parents. Whether their parents pay them for this or not, that is an issue I have no idea about. In the next slide, for me, one of the most critical areas that we have to look at when we're dealing with education on plantation schools is the teachers. You see, all children are entitled to a quality education. Just because they are poor and marginalized does not mean that they get a poor or low quality education. I have been told in Sabah by the education department, it's only necessary to teach them the 3 R's. I disagree with this 100%. These children have a right to have equity, just the same as any other child in Malaysia or anywhere else for that matter. So the way to do this is, of course, through our teachers. We are not allowed to employ trained teachers, but that's not an issue because we train our own teachers. In the next slide, you can see an example of one of our teacher training programs where the teachers get together once every 3 months, except in COVID times, of course. And we have a weekend or 3-day training program for them. This is part of the Coalition of Learning Centers Sabah, where we train for free teachers from any learning center in Sabah. So they come and will do workshops and listen to talks given by expert educational trainers. The Coalition of Learning Centers Sabah, I find, has done a huge amount of work for improving the quality of our teachers. So another important thing of this too is they make a WhatsApp group, which means when they go back to their far-flung estates or plantation schools, they can keep in contact with each other if and when they can get internet connection. The next slide is an example of some of the learning that goes on in one of our classrooms on a plantation. I believe that these children should have all the things that a Malaysian teacher teaches their children. Things like problem-based learning, learning outside the classroom, helping each other to learn. As you can see in this photograph, 2 little girls are teaching each other how to read. So these little kids without a school there would have nothing. They wouldn't be able to improve their future. So I want to ensure that they are not missing out on anything. One important thing about education, of course, we have academic, right? But an important thing is we must have skills training. So in the next slide, you can see an example of some of the skills that are taught in our schools. You can see this young man on the left knitted himself this beanie. Quite commendable for a young boy. And then the whole class knitted a blanket, which is completed by now. So if they have these skills, the boy in the picture actually sold them to workers on his plantation and made a little business for himself. We also have agriculture, where the children can, with their parents, learn about farming and how to sustain themselves, especially during COVID times. This project was deliberately set up in August of 2020 to help empower the workers so that they could be sustainable in times of crisis. Some people lost their jobs, and with this farm, they can sustain themselves continuously. In our next slide, there's an example of a school whose parents work on where the parents work on plantation. These children have a lot of psychological pressures, but in school, I want it to be a safe haven for them where they can come together and share experiences with each other. I want them to have fun, to feel relaxed, because the moment they step out of the compound, they could be caught because of their lack of documentation, right? So it's really important that our schools are designed to be a really protective place, one, physically for the children, and two, where the teachers are trained to understand the psychological pressures on the child. These pressures are huge, and it's really sad for them, especially the teenagers. The little ones don't care too much whether they have a passport or not. They don't really understand what it means. But the teenagers do. And when one of their friends is caught and held, then they are continually worried that they could be the next one. So in our teacher training program, as I mentioned, we do a lot of sessions on how to understand the child and his psychological and emotional needs. Now, you see all these situations that I have talked about just now. But in my next slide, I want to mention how grateful I am for the plantations I work on, to the management team. I have never, in all my nearly 12 years of working on plantations and in non-plantation schools too, I've never felt that the workers were abused in any way. Like I said, I can't speak for others. Look at this example here. In 2019 on Workers' Day, the plantation manager organized for all the workers and staff to come to the padang in the center of this plantation. And everybody, or every family, was allowed to let off a lantern into the sky. And this was the most wonderfully emotional and significant evening, because the management and the workers and all the children felt as one. They all were working for that plantation. They knew that the plantation was supporting their every move. So these lanterns soared off over Sabah, wherever, carrying the hopes and the dreams of all our families. I have nothing but commendation for the managers on the plantations I'm on, who really support the children, support us in schools. Anything I need for the school, they will get for me. Any way to help the children, they will do it for me. And in my last slide, this is a picture of the children walking to school through the plantations. But I'd just like to add a comment, because in Malaysia, we do not have a policy for children who are undocumented to go to school or to get health, access to health. Plantation schools, access to health is better than children in cities. In cities, they can be arrested if they go to hospital. But on plantations, of course, the clinic is there and it will help them. So they are fairly safe on their plantation. But what concerns me, and I've been concerned about this for the last almost 12 years, why Malaysia does not yet have a policy that deals with alternative learning centers and children who are undocumented. These children must have education. They must have access to health. There is no discussion about this whatsoever. It must be done. And yet, until now, after all these years, every successive government says things. They say that they're going to solve the problem. But until now, nothing has ever been done. I go to the education department and they tell me they love children. I have listened to this for years, but nothing is achieved. And that's why I'm so happy when I heard in the earlier speaker's comment that this discussion should not end now. Action should be taken and it should go on. So with this, I'd like to thank you all very much. And if you want to know more about Etania Schools, just look on our Facebook, Etania Schools Sabah. Take care, all of you. Bye.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just be taking on from Dr. Kathryn. So as we wait for everybody for the slides to be put up, let me just introduce myself. I'm Kamini. I used to be a lawyer, as mentioned just now, and I spent the last 5 years working with the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And during my time there, we had done quite a bit of work when it comes to children and child rights, specifically in the palm oil industry. So I'm very heartened to hear, what has been done, what is being done. It was a wonderful presentation by Dr. Kathryn, and it's also very heartening to know that, the industry is taking efforts to move into a space where we are creating safe environments for children, regardless of their legalities and the issues around their documentation. Because I think in our work and in the research that we've done, we've seen more and more with Malaysia, the real gap lies with the undocumented children and how they are being given access, to live a full and meaningful life. So with my presentation, I'm going to get a bit more technical. We're going to look at what the international frameworks are when it comes to children's rights, and then we will look into the aspect of child labor specifically. And finally, we will look at, what is the industry efforts, what's being done by organizations like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil to ensure that, children are protected and are able to grow in a safe and conducive environment. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Right, so who is a child, right? So the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of a Child, which has been ratified in Malaysia, provides that a child is anyone under the age of 18, unless otherwise noted in international law. So I think that's where you would see, like with what Mr. Lakshmanan mentioned just now, we might have legislations that will actually differ in terms of what the definition of the child is. But for the purposes of international conventions, our starting point or the departure point is children or people who are under the age of 18, they are defined as children. We move to the next slide. Right, so what are the fundamental rights of the child? So before we even go into child labor, we're looking at these 4 cornerstones that tenet what is the basic rights of children all around the world. So we'll start with the right to survival. So of course, in order for a child to survive, they need a safe and clean environment to thrive. They need sufficient access to drinking water. Of course, appropriate shelter, physical safety, and even medical care. So one thing with Dr. Kathryn, when you were mentioning just now what is happening in the plantations that you work with, it is good to know that, the aspects of these things are being taken care of the plantations and to create an environment which is conducive. Moving on, we're looking at, the right of a child to grow and develop. Do they have access to education or facilities where they can grow their skills? Do they have access to play? So that's where your sports and cultural activities come into play. The right to participate, are their opinions being heard? Are they being respected, being understood? Do children have a sense of belonging and ownership? And this is especially important because, you know, children are viewed as a party where their voices are not exclusively heard because of their maturity. But this is a fundamental right of a child. When you're looking at situations, you need to see how is this affecting a child? How is this affecting the children in this space? So that is why this has been entrenched into the international principles. And finally, of course, the right to protection. Are they being taken care of? Are they free from harassment? Is the space that they are growing up in free from discrimination and exploitation? And finally, again, are they in a safe environment where they can grow? Next slide. So when we look at international frameworks, of course, the point of departure, like I mentioned just now, we start with the United Nations Conventions on the Right of Children. But then when we look at the aspect of work itself, we're looking at the minimum age conventions from the ILO, and of course, the worst form of child labor, you know, the worst forms of child labor from the ILO. But over and above that, I think it's also important for us to look at international legislations that impact the supply chain. Because whilst we are looking at, you know, countries, we are a country that is importing palm oil, these legislations have an impact on the supply chain. So more and more, we are looking at international laws such as the UK Modern Slavery Act and the California Transparency and Supply Chain Acts, where the supply chain, so for instance, the buyer, if they're based in the UK, they will then be subjected to this law, and they have to ensure that their entire supply chain is free of modern slavery. And child labor goes into that component of forced labor and modern slavery. So in that sense, if they were to source from a base in Malaysia, and if there is allegations of child labor on that particular supply base, then they will not be able to source from this country. So in that sense, it's very important for us to also take note of these legislations that are coming out. And I think another important point that we are looking at in terms of development of international framework is the mandatory supply and value chain due diligence frameworks that are coming up. So more and more we see in legislations or jurisdictions like in the EU, even in Australia, where you're looking at a requirement, a mandatory requirement for due diligence to be conducted on the supply chain of the particular importing or exporting companies. And therefore, these are frameworks that you need to take into consideration as well when you start looking into developing your, if you're a company, you're starting to look into your policy development, how you're managing your supply chain, how you're managing your labor force, including your policies on child labor, to ensure that you're meeting the criteria that is contained within these international frameworks as well. Next. So child labor. So let's get into the meat of this. What is child labor? Child labor is defined as work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential and their dignity, and that is harmful to physical and mental development. So who does this apply to? This applies to all children under the age of 18 involved in the worst forms of child labor, children under the age of 12 taking part in economic activity, and finally, all 12 to 14-year-olds which are engaged in more than light work. All right, so I'm going to break this down a bit, right? So what does this mean? Does this mean that if you're under the age of 18, you cannot work? No, that it doesn't work in that sense. What it means is it breaks it down to a few components. First, if you're under the age of 18, you cannot be involved in worse forms of child labor. So what are worse forms of child labor? That's work that is dangerous or hazardous. It's impacting the life of the child. Those are dangerous work, is basically work that children or people under the age of 18 cannot participate in. If you're under the age of 12, you should not be participating in economic activities at all. And finally, if you're looking at 12 to 14-year-olds, you must be only engaged in light work. So children can only be participating in light work. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the ILO defines light work as not likely to be harmful to a child's health or development. and not likely to be detrimental to their attendance at school or vocational training. So I think if I can give an example, right, of what light work means, a simple one would be, if you are a child or you have a child that's helping their parent out in the hawker centers after school, serving food and stuff like that. If they are at the age of 12 and above, they can be engaged in stuff like that. Because it's light, it doesn't deprive them from schools. I think in the palm oil context, one thing that we would look at, or one thing that could be possibly considered, is if they are following their parents to pick up loose fruits. But then again, that is also subject to when it becomes hazardous and when it becomes something that is becoming harmful to their health. Are they following their parents, but as a result of that, they're missing out on school? That's when you start looking at forms or elements of child labor kicking in already. But the act itself might not necessarily be that the child is subjected to child labor. The next thing is we're looking at young workers. So young workers refer to children who are of legal age, but below 18. So these are children between the ages to 15 to 17. So these people, they can be at work, but they must not engage in hazardous work. And it has to be performed under adult supervision. All right, next slide. Okay, so I think that sort of sets down what is the the framework of a child being in a space or workspace. So now let's look into what the RSPO is all about. So basically, the RSPO is a multi-stakeholder initiative that aspires to transform markets to make sustainable palm oil the norm. So now what does this mean, right? So the RSPO is made out of, it's a member-based organization, and it's made out of the 7 key stakeholders across the palm oil industry. And this is a global organization. So you will have the producers, the growers who produce palm oil. You will have the processors and traders. You'll have the financial institutions. You'll have the social NGOs, the environment and NGOs, the retailers, and keep forgetting the last one. But basically, you have 7 of these stakeholders, and they come together and they define what is the production of palm oil, what should be sustainable production of palm oil. And this is done through a set of principles and criteria and standards that governs what sustainable palm oil is. So with the RSPO right now, what we have is the RSPO Principles and Criteria 2018, which looks into standards that are applied to the production of palm oil. And this is, again, like I mentioned, global. And we look at both environmental standards as well as human rights standards. So I'm just going to go from that picture and I'm going to bring it down to a smaller space to focus on human rights specifically. And when it comes to human rights, again, the focus then goes down to the community that works around the palm oil concessions or where palm oil is grown. So how is this production of palm oil impacting the people there? Are they aware of the impacts? Are they benefiting from the development of the concession? So what happens with the RSPO is we have these standards that will help the producer ensure that they're growing their crop cohesively together and bringing up the community around them as well. So similar to community development, we also have a set of standards for workers who work on the palm oil plantations. And within that, we have a component where it's specific for child labor. So of course, with RSPO, there is a blanket no child labor on plantations. If a child is found to be working on a plantation, and if it's found in an audit, the company will then be given a penalty, which they will then need to clear before they can be issued with a certificate of sustainable production. Besides the PNC 2018, we also have a standard for independent smallholders. Now, with the independent smallholder standard, it is a transformative set of standards where we look at moving smallholders from where they are in a stepwise approach to ensure that they are able to then grow sustainably, grow palm oil sustainably. And within those components, I think you can move to the next slide. I've gotten away ahead of myself. Right, so within these components, we are looking at, we'll have a set of principles and criteria and indicators on how we can ensure that children are being protected. So with the PNC 2018, which applies to the big companies, they have a clear criteria that says that children should not be employed in the palm oil plantation, and there should be no forms of child labor. And what can happen is the indicator then provides a breakdown to the companies to make sure that their systems are conducive enough so that you don't see children on plantation. So how do you look at employment contracts? How do you make sure that there are photographic evidence to ensure that children are not there? You know, so you're creating an environment and a space that we are not going to be a systemic space that will not employ or will not let children fall through the cracks and end up in a situation of forced labor or child labor rather. With the independent smallholder standard, on the other hand, we've taken a different approach. And that's because more often than not, when you're looking at small holdings, these are normally family farms. And with family farms, we are also looking at, you know, we need to balance the need for livelihood together with international human rights standards. So when we look at if you're able to look at the RSPO independent smallholder standards, you will see that the main component when it comes to child labor is that children are not employed or exploited. If you're working in a family farm, children can be present on the family farm, but they need to work under adult supervision, and it doesn't interfere with their education programs. And of course, children are not exposed to hazardous working conditions. Can you move to the next slide? So this, again, with the RSPO, that was the point of departure that the RSPO started from. That yes, you need to make sure that, you know, there are no children on the plantation working. But we've also realized that when you look at the protection of the child, we don't want to only focus on the end result, which is a child working on the plantation. We need to see how are we creating a conducive environment to make sure that children are able to grow up in a way that, you know, that allows them to thrive, not just survive, but thrive. And because of that, and together with the UNICEF, RSPO sat down and embarked on a project around child rights. So this came from a study that was conducted in Indonesia, where it was a focus to look at what are the impacts of the palm oil industry on children. And seven impact areas were identified from this, and they were child protection, child labor, education, maternity protection and breastfeeding, childcare, health and nutrition, and finally water, sanitization and hygiene. All right, so we realized that, you know, you need to cover these impact areas in order to ensure that they are thriving and growing, like how Dr. Kathryn mentioned earlier. And we broke that down a little bit more, worked together with the members of the RSPO to identify what are the efforts that are already being taken, that are already being done. We also looked at our principles and criteria to see how is it we are creating this conducive environment. So you'll see that although in the PNC, you only have that one component on no child labor, but peppered through it in the PNC, the principles and criteria, you will see indicators and criteria like, you know, you need to have breastfeeding breaks, which are adequately provided and decided together with the mother. You need to make sure that housing facilities have schools nearby. So it all comes down to ensuring that you're creating this space where people can thrive. You know, another big one was companies or RSPO members now need to pay their workers a minimum wage. And, you know, we've realized that one big reason why people end up, or why children end up in spaces of forced labor is because the family is not earning enough, a decent income, and therefore they have to supplement the income that comes in. So taking this very holistic approach, we've realized that, okay, we need to look at a space where we're growing and we're being aspirative more than anything else. And with that, we've developed a set of guidances for all the palm oil stakeholders, or the stakeholders that we believe are very important, to ensure that, you know, they are creating a space. So you know how they say it takes a village to bring up a child. So when you're looking at these 4 guidances or these 4 spaces, you're looking at, okay, what is the role of the palm oil producer? You know, when it comes to the supply chain, what are you doing to ensure that your supply chain is free from child labor? Smallholders, what does this mean? What does this light work mean? What does you know, dangerous and hazardous work mean? You know, if my child can't have access to school, what do I send? What do I do? Where do I send my children to? You know, and of course, finally, with the auditors and certification bodies, they then need to look into, they need to come into the auditing space with a framework at the back of their heads that is very protective towards children. So using these points of departure, we've come up with these guidances, and these guidances, as I mentioned, is very aspirational. It helps producers, or wherever you are in the entire palm oil supply chain, to sort of assess what is your, where you are right now. And it's a very intuitive set of guidances where you can, okay, if I'm in this level, this is how I can make my operations better or more conducive. Because at the end of the day, I think this has been repeated time and time again, children are our greatest assets. So what are we doing to invest in them? And this is not just a one party or one actor sort of initiative. Everybody needs to come together. And I think this is where the industry can play its role. You know, whether you're looking at one child or you're looking at the entire nation of children. So I think I will stop there and hand the mic back. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Kathryn, for helping us understand the lived experiences of children living on palm oil plantations, and for sharing the work that you're doing with Etania schools in Sabah. Thank you as well to Kamini for providing us with an overview of the international standards and framework for children in this context, and also for sharing how RSPO is working to make sustainable palm oil the norm. We're going to head into a Q&A session now. We're running a little bit early, which is great. There's a little bit more time for Q&A. So I'm going to invite Dr. Kathryn and Kamini to turn their video on, and we'll kick off. We've got quite a number of questions, so we're going to get started with those. In the meantime, anybody else, if you've got questions, please drop them in the Q&A box, and do indicate which speaker your question is directed at if possible. So the first question that I'm going to start with, first 2 questions actually are for Dr. Kathryn, and I'm going to bundle those. Can you tell us, in your experience, what the percentage is of children who live on these plantations that are documented versus undocumented? And in your experience, do you see that they have different experiences on the same plantation?
Thank you so much to those who asked this question. When I started this project in 2009, almost all children were undocumented. Nobody had any birth certificate, passport, visa, even the parents. The issue here is that many of these children, their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, they're all born in Sabah. So if you're, okay, we have 3 categories of children. One is the Filipino children, one is the Indonesian, and one are Malaysians. These are the 3 main groups. Okay, Malaysians, I still cannot fathom why they are in our schools, because one parent is holding a blue IC. The other parent may not have documentation. And although some people say they can go to government school, that is not true. They can't. I've tried to get them into government school. I have got one child I managed to get in. Indonesian children, you can generally trace back to Indonesia through the generations, but all their family are living here. So they have nobody back in Indonesia. So if you ask them, or you send them back rather, repatriate them, they've got no one to go to. But worst of all are the Filipino children. Without documentation, they're born here, right? Children who are born here. Their families are here. They can't go anywhere because the Philippines doesn't take them back nowadays. Malaysia doesn't want them and tries to send them back. Well, where do you go? You know, and sometimes the authorities say, oh, we're going to send them back to their home country. What is their home country? you need to think about this. They've been here for 3 or 4 generations. Sabah is their home country. They don't know a single thing about whatever is supposed to be their home. So I can understand how complicated this is for the authorities to sort out. And that's why until now, nobody can sort it out. But the person who asked this question said about documentation now. Yes, as I mentioned, in the last few years, the oil palm plantations that I'm working on have made a huge effort to get documentation for these children. I'll give you an example. My teachers are also, some of them are Indonesian. They didn't have documentation. They couldn't come to our teacher training program when I first started it in 2015. But last year, 2019, 2020 was a little bit out because of COVID, but they could come because they got a passport by then. So you can see that maybe it's MSPO, RSPO, I don't know what it is, but there are some very positive signs of the families now getting documentation. And I'm talking here about Indonesian families, yeah? Filipino families, because they don't have a consulate in Sabah, find it very difficult to get documentation. Yeah, have I covered the 2 questions?
Yeah, I think that sufficiently covers both questions. I just want to say, I think it's incredible that, the work that you've done, particularly in the last, few years, has made such a big impact. And as much as we have miles to go before we can sleep, proverbially speaking, it's just so nice to hear about the positives and the progress that we are making. So thank you for sharing that as well, Dr. Kathryn.
Thank you.
No worries at all. My next 4 questions actually, I think, if not more, maybe for Kamini. So I might pop over to those quickly before we come back to joint questions. So we've got a couple of questions on the international frameworks and how they're enforced. So Kamini, could you tell us a little bit more about the enforcement of these international frameworks in Malaysia? Are they enforced to what extent? Yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So looking at the international frameworks, first you need to look at what frameworks they are, right? So if you look at the slide that I presented just now, you will see on the left side, you'll see the ILO Conventions, you will see the UN Conventions. So that depends on whether the country has ratified those conventions or not. So that's the basic overview of things. And how do they ratify it? Is first they say, okay, yes, we will comply to this, and we will then include it into our national legislative frameworks to ensure that this is then being meted out in the country. So with Malaysia, I believe we have ratified the CRC, the Conventions on the Right of the Child, as well as the worst forms of modern slavery and the Minimum Age Act. So you will see that's why we have like the CYPA, the Children's and Young Persons Act, which says that, okay, a child is defined as by, as Mr. Lakshmanan pointed out just now, 17 and above. But then the CYPA then goes down to say, okay, what kind of work the children can do? What or rather people within that age group of 15 to 17 or 18 can do. So that's how you see the ratification has been done. And then when you look at the Child Act, on the other hand, they are defining children as 18 and above. So sometimes that's how you see whether these things has been ratified in a particular country. I think with Malaysia, we have ratified the main conventions around the rights of the child. In terms of the other legislations that I pointed out just now, those are legislations within those jurisdictions. So if you're looking at the human rights due diligence framework legislations that are being discussed in the EU right now, those are for the companies or the producers that are sourcing, from developing countries such as ours. So why it's important for us is that if we don't meet those standards, we are not going to be able to export to these countries, and therefore you lose access to those markets. So that's why it's also important for us to be aware and be able to take or ensure that our supply chains are also clear and meeting those standard requirements, basically.
Great, thank you so much for that. We've got a question on the definition of light work. So the question is, the definition of light work is broad in this context for young workers. Does RSPO have a list of work that is considered light work for young workers? in the all palm plantation producer sort of sector?
Okay, so to date, we don't have one that is specific, but what we do is we do have a guidance. Because you see, with the RSPO, we are looking at companies that are the size of it cuts across. You'll have like really small producers, but at the same time, you have concessions that goes on for miles and miles. So then, depending on what the needs and the assessments are of that particular production, you then identify. But of course, there are the minimum of what what is dangerous and hazardous, and that is then defined within the jurisdictions of the countries themselves. So it's a bit complicated. So just sit with me. What we have is this great RSPO principles and criteria. All right. So this is applicable across the world, globally.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
you need to fit that to scale. So in the instance in Malaysia, what happens is they will take this PNC, or what has happened already, they'll take this RSPO principles and criteria, and then they will interpret it to the Malaysian conditions.
Right.
All right. And within that conditions, they will then be able to break down to see, okay, these are things which normally happens in this country, right? So, children shouldn't be found here. Children shouldn't be found there. So in Malaysia, I can speak for the RSPO, it is very clear when it comes to the principles and criteria, children should not be engaged at all or employed. That just follows our laws as well. But if we're going to look at it from a different point of view, if we're looking at it from a West African country, for instance, where access to school is not possible, and it's more important for the child to be actually bringing in money to the family, then the way it's interpreted will differ depending on the conditions of that country and the needs of that particular space.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Could you elaborate a little bit more about how audits and certification bodies within RSPO might address child rights issues at a larger level, if at all, beyond correction and possibly some sanction for the company? Is there further scope for more systemic changes? So this is a question from Preeta.
Yeah, okay, that's actually a really good question. So with the RSPO, again, you have to look at RSPO, the principles and criteria, as a tool, right? And the intention is that we are pushing the industry to move towards sustainable production. And like I mentioned, the point of departure is that we're ensuring that the companies are free from forced labor and child labor. And that is there in the principles and criteria itself, no forced labor. So what happens is, with the audit system, or the assurance system that the RSPO has, is that they are audited every year to ensure that their certificates are renewed on a yearly basis. And a certificate lasts for 5 years. So if a child labor situation is detected, what the auditor needs to do is, the auditor needs to identify, how did this happen? What is the weakness in the system? What does the company have in place to remediate this system? So in that sense, we are moving the companies to then, one, take responsibility for your issues, and also to create a system where you are also, ensuring that your space is safe and free from any human rights violations. So in that sense, it is more of an encouragement that we have. Of course, there are sanctions in place. If this issue has not been remediated, if it's detected and not remediated within the specific time, there are sanctions in place, and this can even include termination or suspension of the certificate, and that has economic bearings on the member.
Okay, great. I think we're going to ask one more question, as we're very close to the break now. In fact, sort of eating into break time, but because I'm running this and I really want to ask this question, I'm going to ask it. This question comes from Shamila. It's quite a lengthy one, so bear with me. So what she said is, she believes that the issue of child labor, access to healthcare, education, and quality living are also tied to parents' financial affordability to provide these to their children, or the possibility to be less dependent on their children's involvement to generate sufficient income. So her question is, and I think Dr. Kathryn, if you have any feedback on this as well alongside Kamini, that would be great. What social benefits these parents working in the palm oil plantation are entitled to. So what social benefits are they entitled to? And in general, is there a comparison between palm oil laborers in East versus West Malaysia? And she's got a follow-up to that, which is, what aspect of social benefits should be improved for these parents and laborers to pave the way for a brighter future for these children born into this industry and break the social cycle of reliance on the young? You're on mute, Kamini.
Okay, sorry. I just said, oh, that's a very highly packed question, so I'll try and break it down. I'll try and
So I think just a couple of things specifically, right? So social benefits that parents should be entitled to stop, sort of break this cycle, you know, of social reliance on the young to pave the way for a brighter future. I think that's the primary gist of the question. And then as a follow-up to that, any general comparisons between East and West Malaysia in that space?
I think, okay, so it starts this way, right? When you're looking at the benefits, the workers should be entitled at minimum to the similar benefits that are provided in the Employment Act of 1955. All right, so that doesn't differ from whether you're a local worker or if you're a migrant worker. It should be the same, right? So that's the first point of departure. But of course, we are realizing now more and more that the benefits that are in the Employment Act are the bare minimum. Because things as simple as minimum wage, for instance, is that really sufficient to what you call it, to have a family living in a decent way? You know, that's one component that we need to think about. So because of that, I think that's why we are seeing more and more standards like this come about, standards like the RSPO, standards like the MSPO come about, because you are now looking at, okay, the bare minimum is not just cutting it anymore. What are we doing to look beyond? So talking about it from the RSPO point of view, right, and as well as international frameworks that we are seeing being developed right now and initiatives, we are looking at things that when you look at the workers' rights, you need to look at a holistic right, you know, for the person. Is their income sufficient? Do they have access to remedy? Are they in a safe and secure condition, or are they vulnerable? You know, as we know, I think most of us are familiar with the issues around migrant workers in Malaysia, and even, like, you know, we've seen it in other commodities as well, you know, in terms of the rubber glove industry, and for instance. So we need to scale up, I think, and that's where standards like the RSPO can help. But again, that's not the only thing. That's not the only point of departure. You will also have, you know, you look at some companies, they have very good initiatives when it comes to workers. So, like, you know, for instance, they will actually look at, you know, how are they creating a safe space, how they're creating, what some companies provide childcare, for instance, you know. So companies have taken the initiative to build a conducive ecosystem for people to thrive in as well. So I think recommendations need to be given to the companies towards that. In terms of what happens between East Malaysia and West Malaysia, and I'm sure we'll be tackling that in the next session, but I think what is the main thing is the demographic of workers between East and West. So whereas in Sabah, like you see, the workers normally come from Philippines and Indonesia, and more often than not, the focus is on undocumented workers, because that's where they are the most vulnerable ones. And how undocumented workers, you know, how they come about as well, it's just through a small thing, and suddenly you don't have your legalization, you know. Our borders are so porous. So it's as good as just taking a motorbike from Kalimantan and driving into Sabah, and you lo and behold, you're working here, you know. And because in Sabah, they come and they work with their families, they bring their families along. And that's where, you know, the issue of undocumented children comes about. In Malaysia, in Peninsula, on the other hand, you are looking at migrants that are coming from, you're looking at migrants that are migrating from Nepal, from India, or even if they do come from Indonesia, they're predominantly coming as single workers, just male workers, and they're not coming with their families when we're looking at migrant workers, of course. So in that sense, the issue of child labor is not so prevalent in Peninsula, unless you're looking at local workers and their children not having access to school and these basic amenities, which does happen as well. So, and then of course, we're looking at the smallholder aspect and children working on plantations. So in that sense, that's how it differs. I think the issue of undocumented workers, which I think Dr. Kathryn can speak more towards too, is the main space where, you know, these things are happening, basically.
Right. Thank you for that, Kamini. Dr. Kathryn, did you have anything to add to that?
I think that Kamini has pretty well summed it up from the legal. I just like to add on one thing, that the plantations, I actually live with these people on the plantation, so I know very well about their work space and their livelihood. I think the plantations provide them with a very good lifestyle. They have very nice house, water, all of this is free. They can do overtime if they want to improve their income. There's plenty of opportunity for them to do overtime. The thing that concerns me with that is they don't have enough time with their children, which then it falls back on the school, because in the morning, the parents have gone off to work really early and the children have to get themselves breakfast and to school. So I think that the ecosystem that's provided by the managers, the Malaysian managers of the plantations, is pretty good when it comes to the areas that I work on anyway. Yeah, thank you.